What up, friends? It's looking pretty dry later this year, too. And today we're going to be reviewing Pusha T's newest album, It's Almost Dry. This is the fourth album overall by American rapper Pusha T. It also comes 4 years after his excellent previous album, DAYTONA, produced by Kanye when he was doing his sort of 7-song album spree a few years back. DAYTONA was masterful in its execution, showcasing a darkly elegant yet hard look at Push's life, and also his confidence in his rap skills as he basically surges to the top of the rap game. It's Almost Dry is definitely a good follow-up, but doesn't quite reach the heights of DAYTONA. The scope and sounds of the record may be a bit more limited, however that doesn't mean there isn't any good shit on here, because there definitely is. Brambleton is a pretty solid first track overall. The beat is ominous and dark, and Push's very energizing flows help push the story along when it comes to the lyrics. There's just this looming energy over this song that has a sort of modern futuristic noir angle. It's pretty cool. I am pretty hit or miss on Pharrell's production overall. You'll see that later in this review, but he nailed it on this one. It does a great job at introducing us to the various elements and themes of the record while also having some pretty cool bars too. This entire track largely deals with Pooh, who is an associate of Push's group Coupes, and I really like how he introduces him at the beginning, but also throws in a bar name dropping him at the end to kind of round out the entire story. I'm also a really big fan of the black Rari white hood make it a race thing. It's a pretty clever line. There's another great beat in play here with Let the Smoker Shine the Coupes featuring a very fuzzy vocal sample as its backbone. The sort of chaotic nature of this instrumental alongside Push's very aggressive flows paints a pretty interesting picture of a moral dilemma that Push essentially brings up, how, he's heavily invested in the drug trade and that's largely how he found a lot of his success, but also he's part of a society that essentially rewards not playing fair. It essentially rewards people not going the average 9-to-5 job route, so is he really to blame? I think the sort of screeching samples and sound effects are actually a pretty good sort of metaphor for the powers that be almost laughing at the average man because, a lot of racist policies from the people in charge are what led communities to rely on the drug trade because, back in the day, white flight was a thing and a lot of those businesses and government officials essentially abandoned their communities, so something had to fill in the gaps. It's honestly a pretty great way to tie in his own personal history to an uncomfortable truth that many might not want to hear. Now we got the first instance of Kanye production with Dreaming of the Past, and you can immediately tell it's him thanks to those soulful vocal samples and pianos. This one's just taking me to church, man. The bounce on this one is so good. The tone on this one is also noticeably a bit more lighthearted compared to the previous songs, and that chorus is also pretty unique for him too. The way the sample and the piano interact with Push is very lively, and it also showcases his sort of success story, and I especially love the line of, "Didn't have to reinvent the wheel, just a better design." Kanye's verse is also pretty good, matching Push's energy, however it does feel a bit underdeveloped in comparison. The song also just kind of abruptly ends, which is a bit unfortunate. Neck and Wrist is another Pharrell-produced track that's pretty good, I think. It has a sort of dark and almost psychedelic energy to it that's pretty interesting. I'm really digging that wavy synth and all of these sort of vocal effects and sound effects that are going on in the background here. It all adds up to this sort of haze of energy, which is even down to Push's very nonchalant flows. It has a confident vibe that expresses how Push and Jay-Z, who is also featured on this track, are just kind of relishing their success and living the life. They don't really have a lot of concerns or fears to them right now. They're essentially just taking it easy because they made it. The ending to Jay's verse is also a really interesting moment of intimacy and somberness, and I feel like it's a very distinct standout on the record. Next up we have a more simplistic track, Just So You Remember, but it's still a very powerful one, I think. The vocal sample, in typical Kanye production fashion, sounds very good being isolated here, and the sort of echoing, popping beat lets the vocals take center stage, which is really nice. It gives Push all the spotlight he needs to channel his aggressive flows, and I like the structure of this track too, with the first verse being very long in comparison to the second and third. It has a sort of storytelling aesthetic to it that's pretty neat. It's pretty experimental, and despite how simplistic it is at times, you can sense a rise in energy, which I think is pretty cool. Diet Coke is a pretty interesting song coming after the previous one, as it feels very light and glittery in comparison to the rising anger that we felt last time. Still, this beat is delicate for good reason, as it largely details how Push essentially rose to his success and all the struggles that he had to deal with. It's got a very full sound despite its sort of rigid nature, thanks to all the layers that it's got going on here. And I really also appreciate the passion that a lot of the flows on this track display, really. After this, though, I have to say the album kind of dips in quality for like the next 4 tracks, unfortunately. Rock and Roll's not too bad, and I do think Kid Cudi's hook is fairly interesting, but the beat, on the other hand, is pretty bland in comparison. The vocal sample on here is also pretty obnoxious, and kind of takes me out of the song a bit. The track also has a pretty odd contrast between the very gritty hook and the more mainstream and safe-sounding beat. It's a combination that I just don't think works very well together, and Kanye's verse on this one also isn't the best. I'm also kind of tired of Kanye bitching about Kim Kardashian at this point, especially after some of the more recent stunts that he's been doing. Like, come on, man. Like, we're on some actual weirdo shit now, and I don't know how I feel about putting it into the song. Call My Bluff, unfortunately, is probably tied with the next track for the worst song on the record, I have to say. The beat here is so basic, and Push has practically no energy over it either. The flows are not very interesting, and I find that the progression is also pretty stagnant. There's not really many changes going on with the beat or Push himself here. The chorus is delivered kind of awkwardly, and the second verse largely followed this trend as well. There's nothing really like interesting or unique about this one other than the fact that it bores me. Continuing Pharrell's string of kind of bland and uninteresting production, we have Scrape It Off. The beat is so rigid and lifeless, and Don Toliver and Uzi just sound like robots over this. It's basically everything bad about this sort of basic-ass pop rap sound, just strung into one song. Push does add a little bit of life to it, however, it's not enough to save this weird toy box effect that we've got going on here. Hear Me Clearly, like Rock and Roll, isn't bad, but it doesn't do much to stand out either. The beat, again, doesn't really change much, and we're not really breaking any new ground lyrically here as well. It's still basically talking about Push's involvement with drugs and the drug trade, stuff that we've already kind of heard on previous songs, but however, I do really like the sort of dark, almost electronic production that this one has, and I think it really fits the line of, I move to a different drum like EDM. However, the next 2 tracks mark a pretty great end to the project overall, and Pharrell really knocked it out of the park with Open Air. The beat on this one is just fantastic. That's probably one of my favorite songs on the project. Like, we're going to like Transylvania or some shit with this one. I'm loving how dark and groovy it is, and also how the flows have a sort of storytelling effect to them. The bars also have a bit more wit and humor to them compared to the last few songs, like in these 10 crack commandments, I'm Moses, and Jean-Georges Reservations, I'm dying to eat. Like, this shit is cold and mean, but in like the best way possible. Now, it only seems right to end with a classic Kanye church beat with I Pray For You, right? The somber intro from Labyrinth, the organ, the moment when that organ gets distorted and merged with the main beat, like, it's fantastic. This song just feels like a victory lap for Push, with him just indulging in all of his successes. Malice's verse is also really great, and I think he just backs up the energy that Push brought to the table here. I feel like all of this song and this album in general can be summed up with the line, "You can live forever when the shit you write is timeless." This was a pretty slick project overall, definitely feeling like a victory lap for Push when he looks back at his previous struggles and rise to his fame. The bars were witty and engaging, and I think the flows were also pretty solid for the most part. However, I will say it can come off a bit one note at times. The lyrics tend to not deviate much from either his successes or his involvement in the drug trade, and he doesn't really tackle different angles to a lot of these topics either. Analyzing how he came up in that environment and how a lot of racist policies kind of crippled these communities that ended up relying on the drug trade was interesting. I just wish it was in more songs, really. I just think at times the more interesting topics that he brings up aren't the focus of a lot of these tracks. The quality of the beats also tended to be a little bit rocky. I think on the whole, Kanye's beats tended to feel a lot better than Pharrell's beats did, and putting the two together, they kind of clash a bit, I think. Pharrell definitely did put together some solid tracks though, especially Open Air, which is one of my favorite songs on the record, but I feel like having one producer would have helped kind of cement and solidify this album's identity. All in all, I do still think it's a good project, it's just not the most adventurous one out there. I'm feeling a light 7 on Pusha T's It's Almost Dry. Of course, we do have to talk about album covers on this show, and I think this is a pretty cool album cover overall. It's very chaotic. It sort of, I guess, fits the whole talk about the drug trade and stuff like that. Honestly, it kind of seems like those images that simulate what you see when you have a stroke, but it's that in a good way, I think. It's very different. The color combinations are very interesting, very warm, a lot of like browns, oranges, has some glittery effect. I feel like it does capture the aesthetic of the album overall. It's a pretty good choice. But those are just my thoughts on this newest album by Pusha T. What did you guys think? Do you actually like this better than Daytona? Maybe it's a bit more fleshed out for you? Or are you still waiting for something that tops Daytona's very sort of dark and elegant sound? Let me know. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell, or I'll bleed you dry. That doesn't work at all. But until the next one, farewell.